prairie winds howled like a living beast, rattling the wooden slats of the half-built shack on the edge of town. It was not the kind of place anyone with sense would choose for a new beginning, but Clara Watkins had long ago stopped believing her life would be ruled by sense. She was 30, worn thin by years spent hunched over fabric in a dusty sewing shop back east, her fingertips hard with calluses from needles and thread. But a seamstress's coin didn't buy much beyond hunger, and when the letters came calling for women to head west, promising work, food, and perhaps even a husband, Clara burned her bridges behind her and boarded a stage. No one told her the frontier would bite like a wolf. She arrived with a single trunk, 2 dresses, and a determination buried under fear. When she stepped off the coach into Dusty Ridge, there was no welcoming party, no sweet landowner offering his hand. Instead, the mayor thrust her into the back of a saloon and told her, "Cook or go hungry." She had never cooked for a dozen hard-handed men in her life, but hunger taught fast, and the cowboys didn't care if the beans were burnt so long as their bellies were full. That first night, Clara thought she might cry herself into oblivion. But then she saw him, the cowboy next door. He stood by the water trough outside her shack the following morning, broad shoulders bent as he splashed the dust from his face. His had-shadowed eyes as cold as the river in spring thaw, his jaw lined like it had been carved from stone. Folks whispered his name in the saloon with something between fear and hatred. Caleb, Black, Maddox, a man who'd buried more enemies than friends, they said. A man who lived alone, who drank only when the moon was high, and who shot faster than the law could write down the crime. And he was her neighbor. Clara wanted nothing to do with him. She kept her head down, stirring beans, baking hard biscuits, sewing torn sleeves for the rowdy men who paid her with scraps of coin or promises never kept. But the cowboy's presence gnawed at her, the way a rattler waits in tall grass. Some evenings, she caught his shadow lingering near her window, silent as the grave. When she dared to glance, his eyes met hers through the dim glass, merciless, unreadable. One night, the saloon went quiet as a thunderclap when Maddox strode in. His spurs jingled like death's bell, his hand resting casual but ready on the revolver strapped to his hip. Clara kept her eyes on the stew she stirred, though she could feel the tension like barbed wire across her back. "Who's been feeding these boys slop?" Maddox's voice was gravel and smoke. Clara froze. She didn't need to look to know every gaze had turned to her. Slowly, she faced him, spoon trembling in her hand. "That would be me." His eyes scanned her face, her worn dress, her trembling fingers. For a heartbeat, she swore he might pull iron right there. Instead, his lip curled, not quite a smile. "You'll poison him before winter." Her chest tightened. "Then let me poison you first, sir, so you don't have to suffer long." The saloon erupted with laughter, but Maddox didn't smile. He just stared, those gray eyes hollow as a grave. And for some reason, that stare kept her awake long after the laughter died. Days turned into weeks. Maddox never spoke another word in the saloon, but he was there. Always there, outside her shack when she returned home late, watching as she carried water, sometimes leaving things at her step, fresh venison, a sack of flour, once even a Bible that smelled faintly of smoke. She wanted to throw them back at him, to scream that she didn't need his charity. But her hands clutched them too tight each time. Then came the night of blood. The gang of drifters rolled into Dusty Ridge, wild-eyed and hungry for violence. They drank, fought, and tore the saloon apart, shoving Clara against the wall when she tried to gather the broken dishes. One reached for her, filthy hands groping like claws. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by drunken laughter. Then the room froze. A single gunshot cracked through the air. The drifter's hand stopped inches from her, blood blooming in his sleeve. He held, spinning toward the door. Maddox stood there, revolver smoking, his face unreadable. "Touch her again, and I'll put the next one between your eyes." The drifters cursed, reaching for their weapons. Maddox didn't flinch. He moved like a storm, each shot precise, each step steady. When the smoke cleared, 3 lay bleeding and the rest fled into the night. Clara couldn't breathe. Maddox turned, holstering his gun as if it were nothing, and walked out into the dark without a word. She hated him then, hated him more than ever, because no man who killed so easily could save a woman like her. And yet her heart betrayed her, pounding with something more dangerous than fear. The days that followed twisted Clara's world. Maddox never spoke of what he'd done, never knocked on her door, but his presence became heavier, closer. She caught him mending her fence one morning, his broad back bent to the task without asking permission. When she demanded to know why, he only said, "Can't stand a fence falling apart." Another time, when she burned her hand on the cook stove, she found a jar of salve on her step the next morning. It was unbearable, the silence, the watching, the way the whole town seemed to shrink when Maddox was near. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that beneath that merciless stare was something broken. Something that pulled at her in ways she didn't want to admit. The truth came one stormy night. Clara woke to pounding on her door, lightning splitting the sky. She opened it to find Maddox, soaked to the bone, his arm bleeding bad from a bullet wound. "They're comin'," he said, voice hoarse. "Who?" "Men, from Colorado. Outlaws. They won't leave this town standing. Need your help." Her hands shook as she dragged him inside, tearing strips of cloth to bind his wound. His skin was hot, his breath ragged. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes, not of death but of something heavier. "They'll kill every soul here," he whispered, "and I've done enough killing to know. But I can't stop them alone." Clara pressed the cloth tighter, her heart hammering. "Why tell me?" He looked at her then, and for the first time his merciless eyes softened. "Because you're the only one I trust not to run." The storm raged outside, but inside the shack, silence fell like a vow. Clara knew then the frontier had given her more than a chance to survive. It had thrown her into the path of a man who carried darkness like a second skin, and who needed her light more than she could bear. When dawn broke, the outlaws rode in, guns blazing. In Dusty Ridge would never forget the day the seamstress turned cook stood shoulder to shoulder with the most merciless cowboy in the West, facing death with nothing but grit, fire, and the unspoken bond forged in blood and silence. The story of Clara and Maddox did not end there, it had only begun. Because sometimes, the wild frontier gave no choice but to stand with the devil himself, and pray he'd guard you like an angel.